Dog waited 7 years, and what happened next will leave you in tears. In the heart of Willow Creek, a small American town where everyone knew each other's stories, a mysterious presence had captured the attention of its residents. A weathered golden retriever, his once lustrous coat now dulled by time and the elements, had taken up an unwavering vigil in front of an abandoned house at the end of Main Street. The dog's arrival was as mysterious as the house itself, which stood as a silent testament to untold stories behind its weathered walls. The townspeople first noticed him on a crisp autumn morning, sitting perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. They would later name him Rusty, though he seemed indifferent to any name they chose to give him. What struck everyone most was not just his presence, but his peculiar behavior. Day after day, he maintained his post with military precision, refusing to leave his self-appointed station for more than a few minutes at a time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like, yeah. Tell us which city you're watching from. Stay tuned for more. Kind-hearted neighbors attempted to coax him away with treats and promises of warm beds, but Rusty politely declined their offerings. He would accept food and water, giving gentle tail wags in gratitude, but nothing could persuade him to abandon his watch. Through scorching summer days and bitter winter nights, the dog remained steadfast, his eyes never wavering from their vigil of the road stretching before him. Among the curious onlookers was Emily Martinez, a 7-year-old girl with wild brown curls and eyes that sparkled with curiosity. Unlike the adults who saw Rusty as a mere curiosity or a problem to be solved, Emily sensed something deeper in the dog's unwavering dedication. She began taking detours on her way to school, drawn to the mystery that surrounded him. At first, Rusty acknowledged her presence with nothing more than a slight tilt of his head, but Emily was undeterred. She would sit quietly beside him, sometimes reading her books aloud, other times sharing stories about her day at school. Gradually, the distance between them diminished, both physically and emotionally. "Are you waiting for someone, aren't you?" she whispered one afternoon, noticing how his ears perked up at certain passing cars, only to droop again when they drove by. The dog's brown eyes, filled with an almost human-like wisdom, seemed to confirm her suspicion. Emily's parents, Maria and David Martinez, watched their daughter's growing friendship with the mysterious dog with a mixture of concern and fascination. They had lived in Willow Creek all their lives and remembered when the old house had been full of life, though the details of its previous occupants had faded into the hazy realm of small-town memory. As autumn progressed into winter, Emily's dedication to Rusty grew stronger. She convinced her parents to help her create a makeshift shelter for him, using old blankets and a weatherproof doghouse they purchased from the local pet store. Though Rusty would use it during the worst weather, he never stayed inside for long, always returning to his post as if afraid he might miss something crucial. The mystery deepened when Mrs. Thompson, the town's elderly librarian, mentioned in passing that she recognized the dog. "He reminds me so much of the Johnson family's pet," she said one day, as Emily was checking out books. "They lived in that house years ago, such a lovely family. Strange how they left so suddenly." This casual comment sparked something in Emily's imaginative mind. She began to notice details she had overlooked before, how Rusty would react to certain songs playing from passing cars, the way he would stare at particular makes and models of vehicles with increased intensity, and how he seemed to know every inch of the overgrown garden, as if he had spent years exploring it. One particularly cold evening, as Emily sat with Rusty sharing her after-school snack, she noticed something unusual. The dog's attention was fixed on a loose board on the house's front porch, and his tail wagged in a way she had never seen before. Following his gaze, Emily spotted something glinting in the fading light. As she approached the porch, her heart pounding with excitement, Rusty broke from his usual stoic behavior and moved closer to the spot, his nose twitching with interest. Emily knew she was about to uncover something significant, something that might help her understand why this loyal dog had chosen this specific place to maintain his endless watch. The loose board concealed more than just decades of dust and forgotten memories. As Emily carefully reached toward it, Rusty's tail wagged with increasing enthusiasm, as if encouraging her to proceed. The mystery that had brought them together was about to reveal its first crucial clue, and neither the young girl nor her faithful companion could have predicted the extraordinary journey that lay ahead. In the growing darkness, as streetlights began to flicker to life along Main Street, Emily's small fingers brushed against something solid behind the board. The temperature had dropped considerably, and the wind had picked up, rustling through the overgrown garden like whispered secrets. Whatever she had found, Emily knew it would change everything, not just for her and Rusty, but for the entire town of Willow Creek. With trembling fingers, Emily carefully pried loose the weathered board, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside, protected from the elements, lay a metal box, its surface dulled by years of darkness but otherwise perfectly preserved. Rusty's tail wagged with increasing urgency, his eyes fixed on the discovery with an intensity that made Emily's heart race. The box itself was simple but elegant, decorated with intricate engravings of flowers and vines. A small brass latch, green with age, held it closed. As Emily carefully lifted it from its hiding place, she noticed it was heavier than she expected, weighted down with the secrets it contained. Rusty moved closer, pressing his nose against the box, as if recognizing a long-lost friend. "Should we open it?" Emily whispered to her canine companion. The dog's gentle whimper seemed to urge her forward. With careful movements, she released the latch, and the lid creaked open, revealing a collection of treasures that would begin to unravel the mystery that had brought Rusty to this place. Inside, she found photographs, yellowed with age but still clear enough to tell a story. They showed a family, mother, father, and a young girl about Emily's age, standing in front of the house when it was still beautiful and well-maintained. In several of the photos, a younger Rusty appeared, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight, his eyes bright with joy. Emily gasped as she realized she was holding physical proof of Rusty's connection to the house. Among the photographs, she discovered a diary bound in faded blue leather, its pages filled with neat handwriting. The name Sarah Johnson was written on the first page, along with the date from 8 years ago. Emily began to read, her voice barely a whisper in the growing darkness. "Dear Diary, today we moved into our new house in Willow Creek. Mom says it's going to be our forever home. Rusty loves the big backyard, and Dad promised to build him a special doghouse next to the rose garden. I can't wait to explore everything." As Emily read more entries, she learned about the Johnson family's life in Willow Creek. Sarah wrote about school, friends, and especially about Rusty, who seemed to be her constant companion and protector. The entries painted a picture of a happy family, deeply connected to their community and their beloved pet. But as she continued reading, the tone of the entries began to change. The final pages contained hurried writing, expressing confusion and worry. The last entry was particularly cryptic. "Something's happening. Mom and Dad won't tell me everything, but we have to leave soon. I can't find Rusty anywhere. Please let him be okay." Emily looked at Rusty, who sat beside her with an almost human-like expression of melancholy. "You've been waiting for them all this time, haven't you?" she asked softly, reaching out to stroke his fur. The dog leaned into her touch, offering a soft whimper that seemed to confirm her suspicions. Knowing she had discovered something important, Emily carefully packed everything back into the box. The sun had nearly set, and she could hear her mother calling from down the street. "I'll come back tomorrow," she promised Rusty, hiding the box in a safer spot behind the porch steps. "We'll figure this out together." That night, Emily could hardly sleep, her mind racing with questions. Who were the Johnsons really? Why did they leave so suddenly? And most importantly, why had they left Rusty behind? She knew she needed help to solve this mystery, but she had to be careful about whom to trust with her discovery. The next morning at school, Emily could barely focus on her lessons. During lunch break, she confided in her best friend, Lucy Chen, whose mother worked at the town hall. "Do you think your mom could help us find information about the Johnson family?" Emily asked, keeping her voice low. Lucy's eyes widened with excitement at the prospect of being included in a real mystery. "Mom's always talking about how she knows everything that happens in this town." "I bet she could help," she replied enthusiastically. "But Emily, why are you so interested in that old house?" As Emily began to explain about Rusty and the box, She noticed Mrs. Thompson, the librarian, walking past their table. The elderly woman slowed her pace, seemingly interested in their conversation. When their eyes met, Mrs. Thompson gave Emily a knowing look that suggested she might know more than she had previously revealed. After school, Emily rushed back to Rusty's post, finding him exactly where she had left him. But something was different today. The dog's posture was alert, his ears perked forward, and his eyes fixed on something across the street. Following his gaze, Emily noticed a car she had never seen before, parked just within view of the house. Inside the vehicle sat a figure, too distant to make out clearly, who seemed to be watching the house with great interest. When Rusty let out a low, uncertain whimper, Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. The mystery of the Johnson family and their sudden disappearance was about to become much more complicated than she had imagined. As the stranger's car pulled away, Emily clutched the metal box closer to her chest, knowing that its contents might hold the key to understanding not just Rusty's unwavering vigil, but also the events that had torn apart a seemingly happy family 8 years ago. What she didn't realize was that her discovery would soon set in motion a chain of events that would change life in Willow Creek forever. The following day, Emily could barely contain her excitement as she waited for Lucy outside the town hall. Her friend's mother, Margaret Chen, had agreed to help them search through old records during her lunch break. As the girls entered the building, the musty smell of archived papers filled their nostrils, and the fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over rows of filing cabinets. "Now, girls," Margaret said, adjusting her glasses, "what exactly are we looking for?" Emily pulled out a photograph from the metal box, showing it to Margaret. The woman's expression changed instantly, a flash of recognition crossing her features. "The Johnsons," she whispered, almost to herself. "I haven't thought about them in years." As Margaret searched through the records, she began to share what she remembered. They were such a lovely family. Mark Johnson worked at the local bank, and his wife Claire taught music at the elementary school. Their daughter Sarah was about your age, Emily. She paused, pulling out a thick file. They were deeply involved in the community until... Before she could finish her sentence, a loud crash echoed through the records room. They turned to find Mrs. Thompson standing in the doorway, her fallen box at her feet. The elderly librarian's face had gone pale. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't expect to find anyone here." But Emily noticed how Mrs. Thompson's eyes lingered on the photograph in Margaret's hands. That afternoon, as Emily sat with Rusty sharing her sandwich, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Thompson's appearance at the town hall hadn't been a coincidence. The dog seemed more agitated than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the street. The mysterious car from yesterday hadn't returned, but its presence had left an unspoken tension in the air. "Emily!" a voice called out. She turned to see Lucy running toward her, waving a piece of paper. "Mom found something interesting." Lucy handed over a yellowed newspaper clipping from 8 years ago. The headline read, "Local Family's Dream Project Raises Questions." The article discussed the Johnsons' plans to restore historic properties in Willow Creek, including their own home. As Emily read further, something caught her eye. The article mentioned a town meeting where the Johnsons had presented their renovation proposals. According to the paper, the meeting had become heated when questions arose about the funding sources. The final paragraphs described how some residents had opposed the project, fearing it would change the town's character. A sudden gust of wind scattered fallen leaves across the yard, and Rusty's ears perked up at a familiar sound, the ice cream truck's melody drifting through the streets. But this time, something different happened. The dog stood up, his tail wagging with unexpected enthusiasm. Emily watched in amazement as Rusty began to paw at the ground near the porch steps. Following his lead, Emily began to dig where he indicated. Her fingers soon struck something solid, another box, smaller than the first, but made of the same metal. Inside, she found more photographs, but these were different. They showed buildings around town, some with architectural drawings paperclipped to them. At the bottom lay a USB drive, its surface scratched but intact. As Emily examined her discovery, she heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, she found herself face to face with Mrs. Thompson. The librarian's expression was a mixture of concern and relief. "I see Rusty has shown you where Claire hid it," she said quietly. "I've been waiting for someone to find that for a very long time." Emily's heart raced as she realized Mrs. Thompson knew more than she had let on. "You knew about this?" she asked, holding up the box. The elderly woman nodded, sitting down on the porch steps with a heavy sigh. Rusty moved closer, resting his head on Mrs. Thompson's lap, as if he had known her all along. "I was Claire Johnson's best friend," Mrs. Thompson revealed, her voice thick with emotion. "What happened to them? It wasn't right. But it's complicated, dear. Very complicated." She looked at the USB drive in Emily's hand. "That contains everything they discovered. Everything they were trying to protect." Before Emily could ask what she meant, a familiar car turned onto the street, the same one she had seen watching the house. Mrs. Thompson quickly stood up, her expression anxious. "Keep that safe," she whispered urgently. "Don't tell anyone else what you've found. Not yet. Promise me." As Mrs. Thompson hurried away, Emily watched the car slow down as it passed the house. Through the tinted windows, she could make out the silhouette of someone taking pictures. Rusty moved closer to Emily, his body tense and protective. The mystery of the Johnson family had suddenly become much larger and more complex than a simple story of a family leaving town. That evening, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Thompson's words and the USB drive hidden safely in her desk drawer. Whatever the Johnsons had discovered, whatever they had been trying to protect, it was important enough to make them leave everything behind, even their beloved Rusty. But why had the dog returned now, after all these years? And who was in that car, watching and waiting? Emily realized she was now part of something much bigger than herself, a mystery that had been waiting 8 years to be solved. As she drifted off to sleep, she could hear Rusty's faithful bark in the distance, still standing guard, still waiting. As if he knew that the truth was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows of the past. The next morning, Emily woke up early, her mind focused on the mysterious USB drive. Her father, David, a computer technician, was already in his home office when she knocked on his door. "Dad, I need your help with something," she said, carefully pulling out the drive. "It's really important." David examined the scratched device with professional interest. "This is quite old." "A sweetheart, where did you find it?" Emily hesitated, remembering Mrs. Thompson's warning, but she knew she needed her father's help. "It's about Rusty and the old house," she admitted. "I think it might explain why he's been waiting there." After cleaning and connecting the drive, they waited anxiously as David's computer hummed to life. At first, nothing happened, and Emily's heart sank. But then, folders began appearing on the screen. Inside were hundreds of documents, property deeds, financial records, and old photographs of Willow Creek dating back decades. "This is fascinating," David murmured, opening various files. "These are architectural surveys of nearly every historic building in town." He clicked through more documents, his expression growing increasingly serious. "Emily, these files, they show plans for preserving the town's historic district. But there's something else here." Before he could elaborate, Emily's mother called up the stairs. "David, Emily, come quickly." The urgency in her voice made them rush to the living room, where Maria stood transfixed in front of the television. A news reporter was speaking in front of a familiar sight, the abandoned house where Rusty kept his vigil. Local historians have confirmed that several properties in Willow Creek's historic district, including this abandoned house, may have played significant roles in the Underground Railroad, the reporter announced. This discovery has attracted attention from preservation societies and historical committees across the country. Emily's parents exchanged meaningful looks as the reporter continued discussing the historical significance of various properties in town. "That's what the Johnsons were working on," David said quietly, connecting the dots. "These files, they're proof of the historical importance of these buildings." Later that day, as Emily sat with Rusty, she noticed more cars driving slowly past the house. Some stopped to take pictures, while others had official-looking people taking notes. Rusty watched each vehicle intently, his posture alert but not alarmed, as if he had been expecting this attention all along. Lucy arrived breathlessly with more news. "Mom says there's going to be an emergency town council meeting tonight. Everyone's talking about the Historical Society wanting to protect the old buildings. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. And guess what else? Someone's been buying up properties all around town through a company called Willow Creek Development Corporation. Emily's mind raced back to the mysterious car that had been watching the house. Could there be a connection? She remembered the newspaper article about the heated town meeting 8 years ago, when the Johnsons had first proposed their restoration project. As the girls talked, Mrs. Thompson appeared, looking more worried than usual. "Emily, dear, could we speak privately?" Once Lucy had moved away, the librarian spoke in hushed tones. "Things are happening faster than I expected. Claire, Mrs. Johnson, she always said that if the truth about the houses ever came out, people would try to protect them, and others would try to prevent that from happening." A sleek black car drove past, slower than the others, and Mrs. Thompson tensed visibly. "That's Mr. Harrison," she whispered. "He was against the Johnsons' project 8 years ago. His company wanted to demolish the historic district and build modern apartments." She squared her shoulders. "We need to move quickly now. There's more evidence hidden in the library archives." That evening, Emily couldn't focus on her homework. She kept thinking about the USB drive's contents and Mrs. Thompson's words. Opening her window, she could see Rusty's silhouette in the gathering dusk, faithful as ever at his post. But now she understood that he wasn't just waiting for the Johnsons. He was guarding something much more significant. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lucy. "Breaking news. Mum says someone just offered to buy the Johnson house for way more than it's worth." Attached was a photo showing a formal-looking document with the letterhead of Willow Creek Development Corporation. Emily rushed to her desk and began reading through printouts of the files from the USB drive more carefully. Hidden among the architectural surveys and historical documents were notes in Claire Johnson's handwriting, describing secret rooms and passages in several houses, including their own. "These aren't just buildings," one note read. "They're pieces of American history. They tell stories that must be preserved." As night fell over Willow Creek, Emily heard Rusty barking, not his usual quiet bark, but an urgent sound that made her look out her window again. A group of people had gathered near the old house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Among them, she recognized Mr. Harrison's tall figure, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to others in business suits. Emily knew she had to act fast. Whatever the Johnsons had discovered, whatever they had been protecting, it was all about to come to light. But would the truth be enough to save the historic houses of Willow Creek? And more importantly, would it finally explain why the Johnsons had disappeared so suddenly, leaving their faithful dog behind to guard their secrets? The next morning brought unexpected chaos to Willow Creek. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Reporters clutched microphones and tablets, eager to cover the story of the historic properties and their connection to the Underground Railroad. But amid the commotion, Emily noticed something else. Rusty had moved from his usual spot. For the first time in months, the faithful dog was circling the house's perimeter, his nose to the ground, as if following an invisible trail. Emily watched as he stopped at specific points, pawing at the earth with determined intensity. She had learned to trust his instincts, and this change in behavior had to mean something. "He's marking the spots," Mrs. Thompson's voice came from behind her. The librarian approached with a large leather-bound book tucked under her arm. "Claire used to say Rusty could sense the history in this place. Come with me. Quickly. There's something you need to see." They hurried to the library, now closed for inventory, or so the sign on the door claimed. Inside, Mrs. Thompson led Emily to the restricted archives section. "Before they left," she explained, pulling out a collection of old blueprints, "Claire gave me copies of everything they'd discovered. I've been protecting these documents, waiting for the right time." The blueprints revealed an intricate network of tunnels and hidden rooms beneath several houses in Willow Creek, including the Johnson residence. But more fascinating were the detailed notes in the margins, written in different hands across different eras, each adding layers to the town's secret history. "The Johnsons weren't the first guardians," Mrs. Thompson explained, her fingers tracing the faded lines. "For generations, Certain families in Willow Creek have passed down the responsibility of protecting these historical sites. Claire and Mark were chosen by the previous guardians, just as their predecessors were chosen before them. Emily's mind raced as she connected the dots. That's why they couldn't just leave a note explaining everything. They were protecting more than just their house. They were protecting a legacy. Her eyes widened with realization. And Rusty, he's been guarding not just the house, but the secrets inside it. A commotion outside drew them to the library's windows. Mr. Harrison had arrived with a team of contractors, their trucks parked along the street. They carried surveying equipment and wore the logos of Willow Creek Development Corporation on their jackets. "They're moving faster than we expected," Mrs. Thompson murmured, her face etched with worry. Harrison's company has been trying to acquire these properties for years. The historical designation would prevent any demolition or major renovations. They'll do anything to stop that from happening. Emily's phone buzzed, a message from Lucy. "Mom says Harrison's company just filed legal papers claiming the historical evidence is inconclusive. They want to start development immediately." As they rushed back to the Johnson house, they found Rusty engaged in a silent standoff, with two men attempting to place no trespassing signs on the property. The dog's usual gentle demeanor had been replaced by a quiet, unwavering determination. He stood his ground, neither aggressive nor retreating, much like he had done for the past months. The men eventually backed away, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. As they left, Emily noticed them speaking urgently into their phones, casting nervous glances over their shoulders at Rusty. "We need to find more proof," Emily declared, her young face set with determination. "The USB drive and these blueprints are important, but there must be something else. Something the Johnsons left behind that would make everyone understand why these houses need to be protected." Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Claire once told me that in times of crisis, the true guardians of Willow Creek would reveal themselves. Perhaps that's what's happening now. Perhaps that's why Rusty led you to the first box." As they spoke, more townspeople began gathering near the house, drawn by the news coverage and the growing controversy. Emily recognized faces from all over Willow Creek: teachers, shop owners, families who had lived there for generations. They formed a protective circle around the property, sharing stories of their own connections to the town's history. Rusty returned to his usual spot, but now he seemed different, more purposeful, as if his role had evolved from patient sentinel to active guardian. His presence had become a symbol of resistance against those who would erase Willow Creek's history for profit. Emily felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She might be young, but she understood that she had become part of something larger than herself. The Johnsons had chosen to protect these secrets at great personal cost, and now it was her turn to help carry that legacy forward. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the historic district, Emily noticed something peculiar about the way the light hit the old house's facade. There, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a series of small marks etched into the weathered wood. They seemed random at first glance, but Emily had seen similar markings in the blueprints. They were navigation points, used by those who needed to find their way to safety in darker times. The mystery of the Johnsons and their sudden departure was gradually becoming clearer, but time was running out. Whatever evidence remained hidden within the walls of their old home needed to be found quickly, before Harrison's company could move forward with their plans to reshape Willow Creek forever. As twilight descended over Willow Creek, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something obvious. The markings on the house's facade seemed to be pointing to something, but what? She pulled out the photographs from the metal box, studying them under the beam of her flashlight. In one particular image, taken during happier times, the Johnson family stood in front of the house, but it was their positioning that suddenly caught Emily's attention. "Look at this," she exclaimed to Mrs. Thompson, who had stayed despite the late hour. "They're not just posing, they're standing in specific spots." Indeed, the family members were arranged in a peculiar pattern, with Rusty sitting at a precise point between them. Comparing their positions to the markings on the house, a pattern began to emerge. The gathering crowd of townspeople had thinned as night approached, but those who remained watched with growing interest as Emily and Mrs. Thompson began measuring distances between the marked points on the house. Rusty, who had maintained his vigil throughout the day, suddenly stood and walked deliberately to a spot in the garden, the exact location where he appeared in the old photograph. "He's been trying to show us all along," Emily breathed, her eyes wide with understanding. Every time he sat in that specific spot, he was marking a point on the map. Mrs. Thompson quickly consulted the blueprints she had brought from the library, her hands trembling with excitement. The discovery energized the remaining observers, who now formed a protective circle around the property. Among them, Emily spotted her parents, Lucy and her mother, and several other familiar faces from town. They had brought lanterns and flashlights, creating a gentle glow that kept the encroaching darkness at bay. As they worked to decode the pattern, a series of text messages lit up Emily's phone. Lucy had been monitoring social media and local news, emergency town council meetings scheduled for tomorrow morning. Harrison's company pushing for immediate demolition approval. They claim structural issues make the buildings unsafe. The news added urgency to their search. Following Rusty's lead and using the old photograph as a guide, they began to identify key points around the property. Each location corresponded to markings on the blueprints, revealing a complex geometric pattern that only became visible when all the points were connected. "Claire was brilliant," Mrs. Thompson whispered, her voice filled with admiration. She knew that even if they had to leave, she could leave behind a message that only someone with patience and understanding would be able to decode, someone who would take the time to earn Rusty's trust. A gentle rain began to fall, and the remaining townspeople hurried to set up tarps and umbrellas, determined to protect both the searchers and any evidence they might uncover. The sense of community was palpable, as if the entire town had finally awakened to the importance of what the Johnsons had tried to protect. While examining one of the marked spots, Emily's father noticed something unusual about the garden's old irrigation system. The metal pipes, which appeared ordinary at first glance, had been intentionally arranged in a pattern that matched the markings on the house. Following this new lead, they discovered that the irrigation system wasn't just for watering plants, it was a map. "These pipes," David explained, tracing the pattern with his flashlight, "how they're laid out to mirror the tunnel system shown in the blueprints. The Johnsons didn't just document the historical sites, they created a physical key to help future guardians locate them." As if confirming this discovery, Rusty began to bark. Not his usual quiet bark, but an urgent sound that demanded attention. He had moved to a new spot, pawing insistently at the ground near an old rosebush. The rain had softened the earth, and as they carefully cleared away the mud and wet leaves, they found a small metal plate embedded in the ground. The plate bore no obvious markings, but its placement couldn't be coincidental. It was positioned exactly where several of the irrigation pipes converged, marking what appeared to be a central point in the hidden network of historical sites. Just then, headlights swept across the garden as several cars pulled up to the house. Emily recognized Mr. Harrison's sleek black vehicle among them. The developers had returned, likely hoping to take advantage of the darkness and rain to conduct their survey without interruption, but they hadn't expected to find dozens of townspeople still present, standing firm in their determination to protect their community's history. The sight of so many residents gathered in the rain, armed with nothing more than umbrellas and flashlights, gave the developers pause. As Harrison's team consulted in their cars, Emily noticed something else. Rusty had positioned himself between the metal plate and the newcomers, his stance protective but calm. The loyal dog's unwavering dedication had inspired the town to stand together, just as he had stood guard all these months. The plate they'd discovered was clearly important, but its true significance remained a mystery. What had the Johnsons hidden beneath it? And would they be able to uncover its secrets before Harrison's company could move forward with their plans? The answers lay somewhere in the complex web of pipes, markings, and historical documents. A puzzle that had waited 8 years to be solved. The rain continued through the night, but the determination of Willow Creek's residents never wavered. By dawn, word had spread throughout the community, and the crowd around the Johnson house had grown considerably. People brought thermoses of hot coffee, blankets, and camping chairs, transforming their protective vigil into an impromptu community gathering. Emily, who had barely slept, watched in amazement as her small town came together in ways she had never seen before. The local diner sent over trays of breakfast sandwiches, and the hardware store owner arrived with additional tarps and supplies. Even the school principal announced a delayed start to classes, understanding that this was a pivotal moment in Willow Creek's history. "Look at this," Lucy exclaimed, showing Emily her tablet. Local social media was buzzing with activity. Residents were sharing old photos and stories about the historic buildings, many revealing details that connected directly to the evidence they had uncovered. The hashtag Save Willow Creek was trending in their region. Mrs. Thompson arrived early, carrying a stack of water-damaged documents she had discovered in the library's basement. "These are property records from the 1850s, she explained, carefully laying them out under a protective covering. They show that several families in Willow Creek, including the original owners of the Johnson House, were part of a network dedicated to preserving historical sites. The metal plate they had discovered the night before remained their primary focus. Emily's father and several other townspeople with engineering experience were examining it carefully, discussing the best way to investigate without causing any damage. Rusty watched their efforts intently, his eyes never leaving the spot he had helped them discover. Suddenly, a commotion at the edge of the property drew everyone's attention. Mr. Harrison had arrived with a team of lawyers and city officials. They carried clipboards and official-looking documents, their expressions stern and determined. But as they approached, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Chen, Lucy's mother, stepped forward, holding up her tablet. "Before you say anything, Mr. Harrison, you should know that we've been live streaming everything since last night. Over 20,000 people are watching right now, including representatives from the National Historical Society." Harrison's team faltered, clearly unprepared for this level of public scrutiny. The lawyer whispered something to Harrison, who frowned deeply. The development company had hoped to handle this quietly, but now the entire country was watching. As the standoff continued, Emily noticed Rusty becoming increasingly agitated. The dog moved away from his usual spot, circling the metal plate with growing urgency. Following his lead, Emily knelt beside it, running her fingers along its edge. In the growing morning light, she noticed something they had missed in the darkness. A series of small notches around the plate's circumference. "Dad!" she called out excitedly. "Look at these marks! They match the pattern in the old family photo." David hurried over, and together they compared the notches to the positioning of the Johnson family in the photograph. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. While the adults debated with Harrison's team, Emily and Lucy carefully cleaned each notch, revealing tiny numbers etched into the metal. Mrs. Thompson quickly recognized their significance. "These aren't just numbers," she gasped. "They're dates, important dates in Willow Creek's history." The crowd grew silent as Mrs. Thompson read the dates aloud, each one corresponding to a significant event in the town's past. But it was the final date that caught everyone's attention. It was from 8 years ago, the day the Johnsons disappeared. As if on cue, Rusty began to bark, drawing attention back to the plate. The morning sun had reached the perfect angle, revealing something they had all missed. A slight depression in the center of the plate, perfectly sized for a specific key. Emily's hand flew to her neck, where she wore the heart-shaped locket she had found in the garden weeks ago. With trembling fingers, she removed it. Examining it closely for the first time since her discovery, the locket's unusual shape suddenly made sense. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a key. The assembled crowd held their breath as Emily carefully inserted the locket into the depression. It fit perfectly. For a moment, nothing happened, and Emily's heart sank. Then, with a soft click, the plate shifted slightly, revealing what lay beneath. Harrison pushed forward, trying to see what had been uncovered. But the townspeople stood firm, forming a human barrier. This was their history, their heritage, and they would protect it, just as the Johnsons had done. As Emily peered into the opening, her flashlight beam revealed something that made her gasp. Hidden beneath the plate was not just another piece of evidence, but the answer to why the Johnsons had left so suddenly, and more importantly, why they had ensured Rusty would remain behind as guardian. Inside the hidden compartment, Protected from the elements in a sealed container, lay a collection of materials that took Emily's breath away. There were more photographs, documents, and most surprisingly, a leather-bound journal with the words, "To those who seek the truth," embossed on its cover. Alongside these items was a sealed envelope addressed simply, "For when Rusty shows the way." As Mrs. Thompson carefully opened the journal with gloved hands, provided by one of the town's archivists who had joined the crowd, she began to read aloud. The words were written in Claire Johnson's elegant handwriting. "To the guardians who find this, we hope you'll understand why we had to leave so abruptly. What we discovered about Willow Creek's history was far more significant than we initially believed. These buildings aren't just structures, they're living monuments to courage, freedom, and the unbreakable spirit of community." The journal went on to detail how the Johnsons had uncovered evidence that Willow Creek's historical buildings were part of an intricate network of safe houses and meeting places that had helped countless people escape to freedom. The architectural features they had documented weren't just historical curiosities. They were ingeniously designed hiding places and escape routes. "We knew that revealing this information too soon would put everything at risk," Claire's journal continued. "There were those who would destroy these buildings before their true significance could be properly documented and protected. We couldn't let that happen, but we also couldn't stay to protect them ourselves. That's why we left our most trusted guardian behind." At these words, Rusty let out a soft whine, and Emily wrapped her arms around him. The dog had known all along. His vigil wasn't just about waiting for his family's return, but about protecting the legacy they had entrusted to him. The crowd grew larger as word spread about the discovery. Local news crews arrived, broadcasting live as historians and preservation experts examined the documents. Each piece of evidence further confirmed the historical significance of not just the Johnson house, but the entire historic district of Willow Creek. Mr. Harrison watched from the sidelines, his face a mask of frustration as his carefully laid plans crumbled. His phone rang constantly, likely calls from investors concerned about the growing media coverage. Finally, after a heated discussion with his lawyers, he approached Emily's parents. "So perhaps we can reach a compromise," he began, but was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the crowd. A sleek car had pulled up, and from it emerged a distinguished-looking woman in a business suit. She introduced herself as Regina Martinez, the state's head of historical preservation. "We've been monitoring the situation," she announced, her voice carrying across the now silent gathering. "Based on the evidence being uncovered, I'm hereby initiating emergency proceedings to have the entire historic district listed on the National Register of Historic Places." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Emily's attention was drawn to Rusty. The dog had moved to the edge of the property, his tail wagging with more enthusiasm than she had ever seen. Following his gaze, she spotted another car approaching slowly. The vehicle stopped, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the back door opened, and a familiar figure stepped out, Sarah Johnson, now a teenager. Her eyes filled with tears as she took in the scene before her. Behind her emerged Claire and Mark Johnson, looking older but unmistakable from their photographs. Rusty remained seated, trembling with emotion but maintaining his post until Sarah called his name softly. Only then did he break his vigil, racing toward the family he had waited 8 years to see again. The reunion brought tears to everyone's eyes as Rusty showered his loved ones with affection, his tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. As the Johnsons made their way through the crowd, Claire carried a large briefcase. "We've been watching and waiting," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "When we saw the news coverage, we knew it was finally safe to return. We brought everything, all the original documents, the complete research, everything that proves why these buildings must be preserved." The revelations continued as Claire explained how they had spent the past 8 years gathering additional evidence and support, working with historical societies and preservation experts across the country. They had been forced to leave suddenly when they discovered that certain developers planned to destroy the evidence of the building's historical significance. "Says we couldn't take Rusty with us," Mark Johnson added, his voice breaking slightly. "We needed someone we could trust completely to guard these secrets until the right time came, until someone with the heart to understand their importance found them. He was always the most loyal protector we had." Emily felt a surge of pride and understanding. Rusty hadn't just been waiting. He had been fulfilling a sacred trust, guarding both the physical evidence and the spirit of what the Johnsons had discovered. And somehow, he had known to guide her to the truth when the time was right. The following days transformed Willow Creek into a hub of activity unlike anything the small town had ever seen. News crews camped out on Main Street, historians and preservationists pored over the Johnsons' documentation, and tourists began arriving to see the historic buildings for themselves. But amid all the chaos, the most remarkable transformation was happening within the community itself. The town hall had been converted into a temporary museum, displaying the evidence the Johnsons had collected over the years. Claire Johnson, now working alongside preservation experts, guided visitors through the exhibits, explaining how each building in the historic district had played its part in American history. These weren't just houses, she explained to a captivated audience. They were beacons of hope, carefully designed to protect and guide those seeking freedom. Every architectural detail, every seemingly decorative element had a purpose. She gestured to detailed drawings showing how ordinary-looking features concealed escape routes and hiding places. Emily spent every moment she could with Sarah Johnson, who shared stories about growing up in the house and their years away. It was hard leaving Rusty behind, Sarah admitted, scratching behind the dog's ears. But Mom and Dad said he had a special purpose, that he would know what to do when the time was right. And he did. He found you. Mr. Harrison's development company had withdrawn their proposals, and instead, a new initiative was taking shape. Local businesses and residents were pledging support for a restoration project that would preserve the historic district while making it accessible to visitors and researchers. We were wrong to try to erase this history, Harrison himself admitted during a town council meeting. His unexpected change of heart came after spending an afternoon touring the sites with Claire Johnson and hearing the full story of what these buildings represented. These structures deserve to be preserved, not just for Willow Creek, but for future generations. The Johnson House was becoming the centerpiece of the preservation effort. Architects and historians worked together to document every detail, while volunteers helped clear away years of neglect from the garden. Rusty supervised all the activity from his usual spot, now accompanied by either Emily or Sarah, his two favorite people united at last. One afternoon, as Emily helped clean up the garden, she found another surprise, a tin box buried near the rose bushes. Inside were letters written by past residents of the house, each adding to the story of Willow Creek's role in history. One letter, dated 1855, spoke of a family helped to freedom thanks to the secret passages and the bravery of the town's residents. The spirit of those early guardians lived on through every generation, Mrs. Thompson explained during one of her now famous historical tours. The Johnsons weren't the first to protect these secrets, and thanks to everyone here, they won't be the last. The national media coverage brought unexpected reunions. Descendants of families who had passed through Willow Creek decades ago began reaching out, sharing their own stories and documents. Each new piece of information added depth to the town's rich history and confirmed the importance of preserving these buildings. Emily's parents had become integral to the preservation effort. David's technical skills proved invaluable in documenting and mapping the historical sites, while Maria organized community support and volunteered programs. The Martinez family, like many others in Willow Creek, had found their own role in protecting this legacy. Lucy and her mother created a digital archive, collecting and organizing the flood of historical information that continued to emerge. Their database became a resource for researchers and historians studying similar sites across the country. "Mom says we're making history by saving history," Lucy proudly told Emily. As autumn painted the trees of Willow Creek in brilliant colors, preparation began for a special ceremony. The town would officially dedicate the historic district as a protected site, honoring both its past significance and its future role in education and remembrance. The date chosen held special meaning. It was exactly 8 years and 1 day after the Johnsons had left town. The evening before the ceremony, Emily sat with Rusty on the porch of his old home, now being carefully restored to its former glory. Sarah joined them. Sharing stories about the happy years she had spent in the house before they had to leave, the three of them watched the sunset, comfortable in the knowledge that the secrets they had helped protect would now be preserved forever. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "when we left, Dad said that someday someone would understand why Rusty stayed behind. Someone who could see that he wasn't just waiting. He was guarding something precious." She smiled at Emily. "He was right about everything, especially about you." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Emily reflected on how much had changed since she first noticed the patient dog keeping his vigil. What had seemed like a simple mystery had revealed itself to be something far more meaningful. A story of courage, dedication, and the power of community to preserve what matters most. Tomorrow would bring crowds and cameras, speeches and ceremonies. But for now, in the quiet evening, Emily was content to sit with Rusty and Sarah, listening to the wind whisper through the old trees that had witnessed so much history. The garden's roses, carefully tended back to health, released their sweet fragrance into the air, as if celebrating the triumph of patience, loyalty and truth. The morning of the dedication ceremony dawned bright and clear, as if nature itself was celebrating with Willow Creek. The historic district had been transformed, with restored buildings gleaming in the autumn sunlight and carefully tended gardens bursting with colorful blooms. Flags and banners fluttered in the gentle breeze, each one celebrating a different aspect of the town's rich history. The Johnson House, now fully restored to its original beauty, stood as the centerpiece of the celebration. Its windows sparkled, its paint fresh and welcoming, and its garden meticulously recreated from Claire's old photographs. The rose bushes, under which so many secrets had been hidden, were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the air with sweet memories. Rusty, freshly groomed and wearing a special blue collar for the occasion, sat proudly in his familiar spot, but now with a different purpose. No longer a silent sentinel guarding hidden truths, he had become a symbol of unwavering loyalty and the power of patience. Sarah sat beside him, one arm draped around his neck, while Emily completed their small circle. "It's strange," Sarah mused, watching the growing crowd. "For 8 years, this place held so many secrets. Now it's going to be a place where people come to learn and understand." She smiled at Emily. "And it's all because you took the time to understand why one dog refused to leave his post." The ceremony itself was more than just a dedication. It was a celebration of community and perseverance. Speakers included historians, preservationists, and community leaders. But the most moving moments came from the personal stories. Claire Johnson's speech brought tears to many eyes as she described their years of research and the difficult decision to leave in order to protect what they had discovered. "We had to trust that someday, someone would understand," Claire said, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "We had to believe that the truth would eventually come to light, guided by the most loyal guardian we could have asked for." She gestured to Rusty, who wagged his tail at the attention. "And we had to hope that when that time came, our community would stand together to protect this precious heritage." Mr. Harrison, in an unexpected turn, announced the creation of a foundation dedicated to supporting historical preservation efforts across the country. What almost became a story of loss has transformed into one of discovery and renewal, he declared. "The lessons we've learned in Willow Creek should be shared with other communities facing similar challenges." As part of the ceremony, Emily and Sarah unveiled a special plaque that would stand in the garden. It told not only the history of the house and its role in American history, but also the story of a faithful dog who had waited 8 years to complete his mission. Beside the plaque, a smaller marker simply read, "Rusty's Watch, where patience and loyalty protected history." The celebration continued into the evening with a community festival. The streets of the historic district were filled with music, food, and storytelling. Local artists had created works inspired by the buildings, histories, and children performed plays depicting the stories that had been uncovered. As twilight approached, Emily found herself back at the Johnson house with Rusty and Sarah. The crowd had thinned, and a peaceful quiet had settled over the garden. The three sat on the porch steps, sharing stories and dreams for the future. "Mom says we're moving back," Sarah revealed, her eyes shining. The Historical Society wants her to oversee the ongoing preservation work, and Dad's been offered a position at the new research center they're establishing here. Emily felt her heart swell with joy at the news. The house would be a home again, filled with life and laughter. Rusty would finally be reunited with his family permanently, though everyone knew he would always welcome Emily's visits. The legacy of Willow Creek had been secured, but more importantly, the spirit of community that had made the town special from its earliest days had been renewed and strengthened. The historic buildings would stand as monuments not just to the past, but to the enduring power of loyalty, patience, and the courage to stand guard over what matters most. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Rusty lifted his head and let out a contented sigh. His long vigil was over, but his story would live on, inspiring future generations to recognize the importance of preserving history and the extraordinary impact that unwavering dedication can have. Emily looked at her friend. Both the dog who had trusted her with his secrets and the girl who had been brave enough to leave him behind to protect something greater than themselves. Together, they had helped write a new chapter in Willow Creek's history, one that proved that sometimes the most powerful guardians of truth are not the loudest or the strongest, but the most patient and faithful. The evening breeze carried the sweet scent of roses through the garden, mingling with the sounds of distant music and laughter from the festival. In that moment, Emily understood that while one chapter had ended, countless others were just beginning. The stories of Willow Creek would continue to unfold, guided by the example of a loyal dog who had shown them all the true meaning of dedication. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Rusty, Emily, and the extraordinary community of Willow Creek has touched your hearts. The power of loyalty, perseverance, and the courage to protect what matters most can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. If this tale of patience and dedication has moved you, remember to subscribe to our channel and like this video. We have many more inspiring stories waiting to be shared, each exploring the remarkable bonds that connect us all. Join us in the comments below to share your thoughts on this incredible journey, and don't miss our upcoming content. Together, we'll continue to discover and celebrate stories that remind us of the extraordinary impact one faithful heart can have on the world.